November 1944, Camp Concordia, Kansas. Wehrmacht Corporal Friedrich Weber stepped onto a scale in the camp infirmary, and the American medic's eyes widened. The German prisoner had gained 23 pounds in 4 months. The medic checked his chart twice, certain there'd been a mistake. There wasn't. Weber wasn't alone. Across America, in over 500 prisoner of war camps, scattered from Texas to Minnesota, from California to Georgia, something extraordinary was happening. German soldiers, men who had arrived gaunt and hollow-eyed from years of wartime deprivation, were gaining weight, not just a few pounds. Substantial, visible, medically documented weight gain that would have seemed impossible anywhere else in the war-torn world of 1944. Their comrades in Soviet camps were dying by the thousands from starvation. Civilians across Europe were surviving on bread and thin soup. Even American citizens faced rationing and shortages. Yet here, behind barbed wire on American soil, enemy soldiers were eating better than they had during their entire service in the Wehrmacht. Better, in many cases, than they had ever eaten in their lives. What Weber and 400,000 other German prisoners didn't know was that their treatment would help win not just the war, but the peace that followed. The numbers alone tell an extraordinary story. Between 1943 and 1946, the United States held over 400,000 German prisoners of war on American soil, the largest such operation in the nation's history. These men were scattered across 46 states in a vast network of camps, branch camps, and work details that stretched from the cotton fields of Alabama to the wheat farms of North Dakota. Some camps held thousands of prisoners. Others were small work details with fewer than 50 men. Together, they formed an invisible army of captive labor that would transform both the prisoners and the communities that housed them. The journey to America began in North Africa, Italy, and later France, where German soldiers surrendered by the tens of thousands. After initial processing, they were loaded onto Liberty ships for the transatlantic crossing, a voyage that took 2 to 3 weeks. Most had never been on a ship before. Many had never left Germany. They crossed an ocean to a country they knew only through propaganda, a country they'd been taught to see as corrupt, violent, and barbaric. Nazi propaganda had painted a dark picture of America. German soldiers were told that Americans executed prisoners, that the country was controlled by Jewish financiers and criminal gangs, that its people were soft, decadent, and morally bankrupt. Captured soldiers expected the worst. Some had sewn civilian clothes into their packs, planning escape attempts. Others carried concealed suicide pills, preferring death to what they imagined awaited them. The reality they found would shatter every expectation. From the American perspective, this massive influx of prisoners presented both a challenge and an opportunity. The United States faced a severe labor shortage. Millions of American men were serving overseas, leaving farms, factories, and essential industries desperately understaffed. German POWs represented a solution, but only if they could be housed, fed, and managed according to international law. The Geneva Convention, which the United States had signed, laid out specific requirements for prisoner treatment. Food, shelter, medical care, and humane conditions weren't just moral obligations, they were legal ones. But American strategy went beyond mere compliance. Military planners and government officials understood something that would prove crucial in the years ahead. The war would end. When it did, Germany would need to be rebuilt, not just physically, but ideologically. The men in these camps would return home. What they told their families, their communities, their children about America would matter. If they returned as enemies, bitter and resentful, they would poison the peace. If they returned with a different story, they might become unexpected ambassadors for democracy and reconciliation. The camps themselves reflected this thinking. Built hastily but efficiently, they consisted of rows of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire fences and guard towers. Inside those fences, however, The camps functioned almost like small towns. Each had mess halls, infirmaries, recreation areas, and workshops. Prisoners slept in bunks with clean mattresses and wool blankets. They had access to showers, latrines, and medical care. The Red Cross inspected regularly, ensuring compliance with international standards. Daily life followed a structured routine. Reveille sounded at 6. Roll call, then breakfast. Work assignments or educational programs filled the mornings and afternoons. Evenings were free time for sports, music, reading, or socializing. Lights out at 10. It was regimented but not harsh, controlled but not cruel. The guards, mostly American soldiers, deemed unfit for combat duty due to age or minor disabilities, maintained discipline without brutality. There were rules, of course. Escape attempts were punished. Disrespect toward guards brought consequences, but the baseline treatment remained consistent, firm, fair, and fundamentally humane. This was the system, but it was the food that changed everything. The first meal told them everything they needed to know about how wrong they'd been. Corporal Hans Dietrich, captured near Monte Cassino in May 1944, remembered that first American meal for the rest of his life. After weeks of processing through North Africa and a rough Atlantic crossing with seasickness and anxiety, he entered a mess hall in Camp Forest, Tennessee, and couldn't believe what he saw. Long tables, metal trays, and behind the serving line, American cooks ladling out portions that seemed impossibly large. Breakfast, scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter, fried potatoes, coffee with real sugar, and fresh milk. Dietrich stared at his tray. In 2 years with the Wehrmacht, he'd never seen this much food at once. The eggs alone, 3 of them, would have been a luxury in Germany, where civilians were rationed to 1 egg per week. The bacon, thick strips of it, was something he hadn't tasted since before the war. And butter. Real butter, not the ersatz margarine that German soldiers choked down. He ate slowly at first, suspecting a trick. Perhaps this was a one-time show for Red Cross inspectors. Tomorrow would bring thin gruel and stale bread. But tomorrow came, and the meals kept coming. Lunch. Beef stew thick with meat and vegetables, fresh bread, potatoes, carrots, and apple cobbler for dessert. Dinner. Pork chops, green beans, mashed potatoes with gravy, salad, and cake. The portions were American-sized, generous to the point of excess. The numbers were documented meticulously because the Geneva Convention required it. Each German prisoner received a minimum of 4,000 calories per day, the same ration as American soldiers in combat. By comparison, German civilians in 1944 survived on roughly 1,900 calories daily. Soviet prisoners in German camps received as little as 700 calories. The contrast wasn't just significant, it was staggering. The weekly menu rotation ensured variety. Monday might be roast chicken, Tuesday, spaghetti with meat sauce, Wednesday, fried fish, Thursday, pot roast, Friday, pork chops, Saturday, ham, Sunday, steak. Between meals, the camp canteen sold candy bars, cigarettes, and soft drinks that prisoners could purchase with the 80 cents per day they earned from work details. Fresh vegetables appeared at every meal. Lettuce, tomatoes, carrots, peas, corn, beans. In Germany, fresh produce had become a distant memory for most citizens. Here, it was routine. Fruit, too. Apples, oranges, bananas, grapes. Desserts were standard. Pies, cakes, cookies, puddings. The Germans, accustomed to rationing sugar and flour, found this abundance almost obscene. Coffee shocked them most. Not the roasted grain substitutes or chicory mixtures they'd endured in the Wehrmacht, but real coffee, hot and strong, available at every meal with unlimited sugar and fresh cream. For men who'd spent years drinking bitter ersatz coffee that tasted like burned wood, this simple pleasure became a daily reminder of just how much they'd been lied to about American poverty and weakness. The effect on their bodies was immediate and visible. Within weeks, gaunt faces filled out, hollow cheeks disappeared, ribs that had been countable beneath skin vanished under healthy flesh. Men who'd arrived weighing 130 pounds, their bodies wasted from years of inadequate rations and combat stress, climbed to 150, 160, even 170 pounds. Camp medical records documented the transformation with clinical precision. Dr. Wilhelm Brenner, a captured German physician who worked in the Camp Concordia infirmary, kept detailed notes that would later be published. The average prisoner, he wrote, gained between 15 and 25 pounds in the first 6 months of captivity. Some gained more. A few Wehrmacht soldiers who'd spent years on the Eastern Front, where conditions had been particularly brutal, gained 40 or even 50 pounds. Their bodies, starved for so long, responded to adequate nutrition with dramatic changes. Why such generosity toward enemy soldiers? The practical reasons were straightforward. Healthy prisoners worked harder and caused fewer problems. The Geneva Convention required adequate nutrition, and the United States had the agricultural capacity to provide it. America produced more food than it could consume. Warehouses overflowed with grain. Farms couldn't find enough workers to harvest crops. Feeding prisoners well cost little and solved multiple problems. But there were strategic calculations too. American intelligence understood psychological warfare. Every prisoner who returned to Germany would tell his story. If that story involved starvation and abuse, it would fuel resentment and resistance. If it involved fair treatment and adequate food, it would undermine Nazi propaganda and create goodwill for the occupation to come. The investment in prisoner welfare was, in essence, an investment in post-war peace. The German prisoners struggled to reconcile what they experienced with what they'd been taught. Nazi ideology had preached American degeneracy, Jewish control, and capitalist exploitation. Yet here were ordinary American soldiers, many of them sons of farmers and factory workers, ensuring that their enemies ate well. Here was a nation fighting a global war on multiple fronts, yet finding the resources to feed prisoners better than German civilians ate at home. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Letters home, carefully censored but still revealing, spoke of the food in amazed tones. Mothers and wives reading these letters in bombed German cities, surviving on turnips and black bread, could barely comprehend their imprisoned sons and husbands describing steaks and ice cream. Some refused to believe it, assuming the letters were American propaganda. But it was true. Every word. And food was only the beginning. Medical care came next, and with it, another revelation about the country that was supposed to be their cruel captor. Every camp maintained an infirmary staffed by American military doctors and medics, often supplemented by captured German physicians and medics who were allowed, even encouraged, to practice their profession. These facilities weren't makeshift field hospitals, but proper medical clinics with examining rooms, pharmacies, dental chairs, and surgical capabilities for minor procedures. The Red Cross inspected them regularly and consistently found them meeting or exceeding Geneva Convention standards. For many prisoners, this represented their first proper medical care in years. The Wehrmacht's medical services, excellent in the early war years, had deteriorated badly by 1943. Supplies ran short. Field hospitals became overwhelmed. Soldiers learned to live with untreated dental problems, chronic infections, and old injuries that never healed properly. They accepted pain and disability as the price of military service. American doctors changed that. Dental care, in particular, astonished the Germans. Camp dentists didn't just treat emergencies. They provided comprehensive care. Prisoners received fillings, extractions when necessary, and even dental prosthetics. Corporal Ernst Mueller, who lost 3 teeth in combat and learned to eat on one side of his mouth, received a partial bridge at Camp Ruston, Louisiana. The procedure was free, performed by an American military dentist with the same care he'd provide to his own soldiers. Vaccinations were standard. Every prisoner received immunizations against typhus, tetanus, and other diseases. Those with chronic conditions received treatment. Diabetes, relatively rare but not unknown, was managed with insulin. Heart conditions were monitored. Skin diseases, rampant in the trenches and barracks of the Wehrmacht, were treated with medications that had been unavailable in Germany for years. The psychological impact of this care ran deep. These weren't conquerors bestowing mercy on the defeated. These were professionals doing their jobs, treating enemy soldiers with the same competence and concern they show anyone. German prisoners, accustomed to a military hierarchy that viewed ordinary soldiers as expendable, found this egalitarian approach both strange and moving. But healthcare was only one dimension of camp life. Recreation and culture revealed another side of American strategy. The camps weren't just holding pens. They were designed to keep men occupied, engaged, and physically active. Every facility has sports equipment, soccer balls, volleyballs, boxing gloves, track and field equipment. Soccer, the German national passion, became a central feature of camp life. Tournaments were organized between barracks, between camps, sometimes even between prisoners and American Guard units, who played in friendly matches that would have been unthinkable in Soviet or even British camps. Music flourished. Prisoners with musical talent formed orchestras and bands. The YMCA and Red Cross provided instruments, violins, accordions, trumpets, guitars. Camp Alva in Oklahoma boasted a 40-piece orchestra that performed weekly concerts. Their repertoire included Beethoven, Bach, and Brahms, but also American jazz and popular music that many prisoners heard for the first time. Sheet music arrived in Red Cross packages. Prisoners composed original works. Music became a bridge between captivity and humanity, a reminder that they were still men with culture and creativity, not just enemy combatants. Theater thrived too. Prisoners wrote and performed plays, often in elaborate productions with homemade costumes and painted sets. Some camps had dedicated theater buildings. Others used mess halls or outdoor stages. The plays ranged from classical German works to contemporary comedies to original scripts written by prisoners. American guards attended these performances, understanding nothing of the German dialogue, but applauding the effort and artistry. Visual arts found their place as well. Prisoners carved wood, painted portraits, created sculptures from scrap materials. Some of this art was utilitarian: furniture for camp use, toys for local children, decorative items. Other works were purely artistic expressions: landscapes of remembered German forests, portraits of fellow prisoners, abstract pieces that processed the trauma of war and captivity through shape and color. Education became a major focus. English classes were particularly popular. Prisoners understood that whatever future awaited them, speaking English would be valuable. American authorities encouraged this, providing textbooks and qualified instructors, sometimes German-speaking Americans, sometimes educated prisoners who taught their fellows. Classes ranged from basic vocabulary to advanced grammar and literature. Vocational training programs offered skills that would matter after the war: carpentry, mechanics, electrical work, farming techniques. American instructors, often civilian volunteers, taught these classes. The prisoners learned eagerly, recognizing that Germany's post-war economy would need skilled workers. They were training not just for survival but for reconstruction. Libraries in every camp offered access to reading materials. The selection was carefully created but diverse. German language books provided by the Red Cross and YMCA, American newspapers and magazines with political content censored, technical manuals, classic literature, even some contemporary fiction. For men who'd spent years with no reading material beyond Wehrmacht orders and Nazi propaganda newspapers, this access to books became a window into broader ideas. Work programs served multiple purposes. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to work for wages, and America desperately needed labor. Prisoners were paid 80 cents per day for their work. paid in scrip that could be spent at the camp canteen or saved. This wasn't generosity, it was law. But the effect was empowering. Men who'd been stripped of agency, reduced to the status of captive enemy, could earn money, make small purchases, exercise tiny bits of freedom within their confinement. The work itself varied widely. Agricultural labor dominated, harvesting crops, clearing land, maintaining irrigation systems. In farming states like Kansas, Nebraska, Texas, and California, prisoner labor became essential to keeping food production running while American men fought overseas. Other prisoners worked in logging camps, fish canneries, and even some military installations performing non-sensitive support tasks. What surprised the Germans wasn't the work itself, but the conditions. They worked 8-hour days, not the 12 or 14 hours common in Soviet camps. They received breaks. Safety equipment was provided. If weather became dangerous, work stopped. Injuries were treated immediately. The contrast with forced labor in Nazi Germany, where slave workers from occupied territories died by the thousands from overwork and abuse, wasn't lost on thoughtful prisoners. Perhaps most significant was the attitude of their American supervisors. There was no sadism, no systematic humiliation, no casual cruelty. Guards maintained discipline and security, but within those boundaries, they treated prisoners as workers doing the job. Some guards were cold and distant, viewing the Germans as enemy aliens to be watched carefully. But many others, especially in rural areas where prisoners worked on farms, developed a pragmatic working relationship with their charges. This baseline of decency, this systematic refusal to abuse men who had, after all, been trying to kill Americans just months before, created a psychological effect that no amount of propaganda could match. The prisoners couldn't ignore what they experienced daily. America wasn't weak. America wasn't cruel. America was something they hadn't encountered before. A nation powerful enough to be generous, confident enough to be humane. Then came the invitations that would change everything. The labor shortage became critical in 1944. With millions of American men in uniform overseas, farms across the heartland faced catastrophe. Crops ripened with no one to harvest them. Livestock needed tending. Essential work went undone. The government solution was pragmatic: deploy prisoner labor on a massive scale. By late 1944, thousands of German POWs were assigned to small work details on farms throughout rural America, living in makeshift branch camps and traveling daily to nearby farms. This was where the carefully controlled world of the prison camps gave way to something unpredictable: direct contact between German soldiers and ordinary American families. In September 1944, farmer Harold Thompson of Sterling, Kansas, received word that he'd been assigned 3 German prisoners to help with his wheat harvest. Thompson, whose son was serving with the Third Army in France, felt deeply conflicted. These men had been fighting against his boy. Yet his wheat was ready, his hired hands were gone, and the grain wouldn't wait for his complicated feelings. The prisoners arrived in an army truck just after dawn. Thompson watched them climb down. Young men, lean but not gaunt, wearing Wehrmacht tunics with POW markings. They stood in his farmyard, uncertain, waiting for orders. Thompson, speaking no German, gestured toward the fields. They understood. Work began. The routine established itself quickly. Prisoners worked from dawn until mid-afternoon, with a break for lunch. Initially, Thompson had his wife pack sandwiches that the guards brought to the field. The men ate sitting in the dirt, grateful but separate. This arrangement lasted 3 days. On the 4th day, Helen Thompson made a decision that would ripple across thousands of similar farms. They'll eat at the table, she told her husband. I won't have men eating in the dirt. Harold protested. These were German soldiers, enemy combatants. His son was risking his life fighting men just like them. But Helen was unmoved. There are boys working our farm, she said. They'll eat like human beings. That noon, 3 Wehrmacht prisoners climbed the steps of an American farmhouse and entered the kitchen where Helen Thompson had set places at the family table. The moment froze all of them. The prisoners, terrified of some trick, some trap. The Thompsons, uncertain how to treat armed enemies in their home. The young American guard, barely 20, equally confused by this breakdown of the clear boundary between captor and captive. Helen served fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans from her garden, fresh bread with butter, and apple pie. The prisoners sat stiffly, waiting for permission. "Go ahead," Helen said, gesturing at the food. They ate slowly at first, then with increasing comfort. Conversation was impossible. No one shared a language. But food, hospitality, the simple act of sharing a meal transcended words. The next day, they ate in the kitchen again. And the next, within a week, it felt almost normal. The prisoners worked Thompson's fields, ate at his table, and returned to camp each evening. A routine developed. They learned to say thank you in English. Helen learned Guten Appetit in German. Small gestures of humanity emerged from the stilted formality. This pattern repeated across rural America. In Nebraska, Iowa, Texas, California, Pennsylvania, and dozens of other states, farmer families made similar decisions. Practical reasons drove it partly. Feeding workers at the house was simpler than packing meals to the field. But something else was at work too, something deeper and more complicated. These were Americans who'd been raised with certain values. You didn't let people go hungry if you had food. You didn't treat workers like animals. You didn't deny basic dignity to men who happened to be on the other side of a war they didn't start. Reactions varied by region and personality. Some farmers remained cold and distant, viewing the prisoners strictly as enemy labor. Others, particularly in heavily German American areas like Wisconsin and parts of Texas, where many families had German ancestry, felt conflicted kinship with these young men who could have been cousins in different circumstances. Still, others approached it with pragmatic American practicality. These were workers doing a job, and you treated workers decently. The Sunday dinners became legendary. Sunday was the Lord's Day across rural America, a day of church, rest, and family meals. For many farm families, Sunday dinner was a week's centerpiece. The best food, the whole family gathered, a time of fellowship and gratitude. Inviting prisoners to join these meals represented something extraordinary. In Marshall, Texas, the Mueller family hosted 4 German prisoners for Sunday dinner throughout the fall of 1944. Martha Mueller, whose husband was serving in the Pacific, later wrote about the experience in letters that were preserved. The prisoners arrived in clean uniforms, scrubbed and nervous. Martha's children, ages 6 and 9, stared wide-eyed at the man their mother had described as the enemy. But Martha had made a conscious choice. She wanted her children to see that enemies were human beings, that hate was a choice, that grace was possible even in wartime. The meal itself became a teaching moment. Before eating, Martha asked everyone to join hands for grace. The prisoners, understanding the gesture, if not the words, bowed their heads, while Martha thanked God for the food, for safety, for peace. When she finished, one of the prisoners, a Catholic from Bavaria, quietly added his own prayer in German. No one understood his words, but everyone understood the meaning. These dinners included traditional American fare: pot roast with vegetables, fried chicken with all the fixings, ham with sweet potatoes, roasted turkey when available. Desserts were elaborate: pies, cakes, puddings, dishes that required sugar and butter that American housewives had saved from their rations. Serving such meals to enemy soldiers while their own husbands and sons fought overseas required a particular kind of moral courage, a determination to maintain civilization even in the midst of war. Conversation during these meals was halting but real. Prisoners with limited English tried to communicate. Children asked questions through interpreters. Families showed photographs of sons in uniform. Prisoners showed photos of their own families. Common humanity emerged in these exchanges. A German corporal from Hamburg revealed that his home had been destroyed in a bombing raid. An American farmer's son was stationed in Hamburg's ruins. The absurdity and tragedy of war became visible around these Sunday tables. The relationships that developed were complicated and rarely simple friendship. These were not social equals choosing association. Power imbalances remained stark. The prisoners were captives, subject to return to camps at any moment, their freedom entirely conditional. American families maintained emotional distance, aware that these men had fought for Hitler, that their ideology had caused immense suffering. But within those boundaries, genuine human connection emerged. Children played a special role. American kids, too young to hate, saw the prisoners as curiosities rather than threats. They taught Germans how to throw a baseball. They learned German words for animals and colors. They showed off toys and pets. For the prisoners, many of whom had left younger siblings or children behind in Germany, these interactions carry special poignancy. Playing with an American child in a Kansas farmyard, they could almost forget, for a moment, what they lost and what awaited them. The guards, often present during these meals, occupied an awkward middle ground. Their job was security, maintaining the boundary between captor and captive. But sitting at a family table while a farmer's wife served pie and coffee made that boundary fuzzy. Many guards later reported that these experiences changed how they viewed their prisoners. It was harder to see them as faceless enemies when you'd watch them help a child with homework or laugh at a dog's antics. Not everyone approved. In some communities, particularly those with recent war casualties, the sight of German prisoners eating in American homes sparked outrage. Letters to local newspapers condemned the practice. Some families received threats. Neighbors stopped speaking to those who fraternized with Nazis. The tension was real and sometimes painful. But most families who made the choice to include prisoners in their meals stood by it, believing they were doing what was right even when it was unpopular. For the prisoners, these meals represented something more profound than good food or temporary freedom. They represented a cognitive demolition of everything they'd been taught. Nazi propaganda had described Americans as weak, divided, morally corrupt, incapable of sacrifice or genuine feeling. Yet here were American families, missing their own sons who were at war, feeding enemy soldiers at their own tables, offering hospitality that would have been unthinkable in Germany under similar circumstances. Letters home tried to describe these experiences, though military censors often redacted details. What got through was enough to shock families in Germany. Prisoners wrote of eating meals that included meat, fresh vegetables, and desserts. They wrote of sitting in American homes, of being treated not as monsters but as men. For wives and mothers reading these letters in cities under Allied bombing, surviving on rations that had dwindled to near starvation levels, the contrast was almost unbearable. Their imprisoned husbands and sons were eating better than they were. The strategic brilliance of this approach would only become clear later. Every prisoner who experienced American hospitality became, inadvertently, an ambassador. When they returned to Germany, they would carry memories that no propaganda could erase. They would tell their children and grandchildren about the American family who fed them Sunday dinner while their son fought in France. Those stories would matter in the years of occupation and reconstruction ahead. But in the moment, in the farmhouses, and around the tables where these meals happened, the effect was simpler and more immediate. Hate dissolved, slowly and incompletely, but it dissolved. Enemy became human. The other became familiar. And both sides learned that even in the midst of global war, basic decency remained possible. While German prisoners in America gained weight and learned English, their comrades in Soviet captivity faced a drastically different fate. The contrast between these two experiences reveals not just different approaches to prisoner management, but fundamentally different values about human life and the rules of war. The numbers alone tell a grim story. The Soviet Union captured approximately 3 million German soldiers during the war. Of these, nearly 1 million died in captivity, a death rate of roughly 33%. By comparison, of the 400,000 Germans held in America, fewer than 1% died, most from pre-existing conditions or accidents rather than deliberate mistreatment or neglect. Daily caloric intake marked the starkest difference. In American camps, German prisoners received 4,000 calories per day, enough to support health and even weight gain. In Soviet camps, rations varied wildly depending on location, season, and the whims of camp commandants, but averaged between 1,000 and 1,400 calories daily. For men engaged in hard labor in Siberian winter conditions, this meant slow starvation. Prisoners lost weight continuously. Bodies consumed muscle tissue for energy. Men became walking skeletons, their faces hollowed, their eyes sunken, their movements slow and mechanical. The work requirements reflected this disparity. German prisoners in American camps worked 8-hour days with breaks, safety equipment, and medical attention for injuries. In Soviet camps, work lasted 12 to 14 hours daily in conditions that were often lethal, logging in frozen Siberian forests, mining in the Urals, building railroads across permafrost. The Soviets viewed German prisoners not as humans entitled to basic care but as war reparations in human form, resources to be exploited until exhausted. Medical care in Soviet camps ranged from minimal to non-existent. Camp infirmaries, when they existed at all, lacked medicine, equipment, and trained personnel. Diseases that would have been easily treatable became death sentences. Dysentery swept through camps unchecked. Tuberculosis spread in overcrowded barracks. Frostbite turned gangrenous for lack of treatment. Men died of conditions that American camp hospitals routinely cured. The timeline of repatriation highlighted another crucial difference. American-held prisoners began returning home in 1946 within a year of Germany's surrender. The process was efficient and systematic. By mid-1947, the camps were largely empty. Soviet-held prisoners faced a different reality. The first prisoners weren't released until 1950, 5 years after the war ended. The last prisoners didn't return until 1955, a full decade after German surrender. Many never returned at all, dying in captivity or disappearing into the Soviet Gulag system, where political prisoners and war captives became indistinguishable. The psychological dimension of this difference mattered as much as the physical. American camps maintained structure and routine that preserved dignity. Prisoners received mail, sent letters, maintained contact with families. In Soviet camps, communication with home was rare or impossible. Families had no information about imprisoned loved ones for years, sometimes decades. Men disappeared into the vast Soviet East and became ghosts, neither confirmed dead nor proven alive. Soviet treatment reflected both practical circumstances and ideological choices. The USSR has suffered catastrophic losses from German invasion. 27 million Soviet citizens died in the war. Cities were destroyed. The German Wehrmacht had conducted the war in the East with brutal disregard for civilian life and international law. Soviet anger at German prisoners was rooted in real grievances, real suffering, real trauma, but it was also policy. The Soviet system didn't recognize individual rights or Geneva Convention niceties. Prisoners were a resource, nothing more. British treatment of German POWs occupied a middle ground between American generosity and Soviet harshness. Britain held approximately 400,000 German prisoners, a number similar to America's total. Food rations were adequate but not abundant, averaging around 2,800 calories daily, sufficient for survival and health, but not the surplus that characterized American camps. Medical care was competent but basic. Recreational opportunities existed but were limited. Work requirements were more demanding than in America, though far less brutal than in Soviet camps. The key difference in British camps was attitude. Britain had suffered German bombing, faced invasion threats, and sacrificed enormously. The British public had less patience for generous treatment of enemy prisoners. Fraternization between prisoners and civilians was discouraged and sometimes punished. Sunday dinners with British families were rare exceptions, not common practice. The relationship remained firmly in the prisoner-captor dynamic, without the strange softening that occurred in American camps. British camps also faced resource constraints that America avoided. Britain was exhausted by 1945, its economy strained to breaking, its infrastructure damaged, its people tired and ration-weary. Feeding German prisoners well when British citizens faced continued rationing created political problems. The resources simply weren't available for the kind of generous treatment America could afford. The impact on prisoners reflected these differences. Germans who experienced American captivity returned home with stories of abundance and unexpected kindness. Those who survived Soviet camps returned traumatized, physically broken, and emotionally scarred. British-held prisoners generally reported fair treatment within strict boundaries. A correct but cold captivity that maintained distance between captor and captive. These contrasts shaped post-war German attitudes profoundly. West Germany, influenced partly by the stories of American-held POWs, moved toward democracy and alliance with the West. East Germany, under Soviet control and influenced by the trauma of Soviet camps, developed differently. The treatment of prisoners became one factor among many in the Cold War division that would define Germany for decades. For prisoners who experienced only American captivity, the contrast with Soviet camps remained theoretical but understood. They heard stories from comrades who'd been captured on the Eastern Front. They received letters from families who learned of relatives dying in Soviet camps. They understood their incredible luck. To be captured by Americans rather than Soviets meant the difference between a strange, comfortable captivity and potential death. This wasn't lost on American authorities, who used the contrast strategically. Prisoners were shown newsreels and articles about Soviet camps. The message was implicit but clear. See how we treat you, see how they treat your comrades, and understand which system values human life. It was psychological warfare, but based on truth. The differences were real and stark. The ships that carried German prisoners back across the Atlantic in 1946 and 1947 carried more than just men returning home. They carried memories, stories, and perspectives that would shape post-war Germany in ways the architects of prisoner policy couldn't have fully predicted. Germany in 1946 was unrecognizable to the men who left it. Major cities lay in ruins, their populations devastated, their infrastructure destroyed. Food was scarce. The black market flourished while official rations dwindled below subsistence levels. Occupation forces controlled everything. The nation was divided, its future uncertain, its people struggling to survive amid the wreckage of Hitler's regime. Into this desperate situation came 400,000 men who spent the war's final years in American captivity. They stepped off ships in Hamburg and Bremen, carrying duffel bags and something less tangible but more significant, experiences that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had taught them about America. The conversations that followed were awkward and sometimes painful. Husbands reunited with wives who survived bombing and starvation. They compared experiences. The wives had endured horrors, air raids that turned cities into infernos, food shortages that left children malnourished, the constant fear and chaos of a collapsing regime. The husbands had been prisoners, technically, but their stories described meals with meat and butter, recreational activities, medical care, even hospitality from enemy families. The discrepancy created guilt and confusion. How could they tell a starving wife that they gained weight in captivity? How could they describe Sunday dinners in Kansas farmhouses to mothers who'd lost children in bombing raids? Some prisoners minimized their experiences, sensing that their comfort in captivity seemed like a betrayal to those who'd suffered at home. Others told their stories plainly, recognizing that the contrast itself carried an important message about the nation that had captured them. These testimonies circulated through families and communities. In the rubble of Munich, former prisoners gathered in informal groups to share memories. In Berlin's ruins, men who'd worked on American farms talked about tractors and harvest techniques that seemed almost futuristic compared to German agricultural practice. In small towns where everyone knew everyone, returning prisoners became sources of information about the mysterious nation now occupying their country. The stories particularly influenced perceptions of the American occupation. When U.S. forces arrived as occupiers, they came not as unknown conquerors, but as representatives of a nation that 400,000 Germans had experienced directly. Former prisoners told neighbors that Americans could be trusted, that they followed rules, that they were firm but fair. This grassroots reassurance mattered enormously in the early occupation period, when tensions could easily have exploded into resistance and resentment. The Marshall Plan, America's massive economic aid program for rebuilding Europe, gained crucial acceptance, partly because of these pre-existing positive impressions. When Americans offered help, Germans who'd been prisoners remembered being fed and treated well. The offers seemed consistent with what they experienced. Trust, fragile and limited but real, made cooperation possible. Individual relationships endured across years and oceans. Former prisoners maintained correspondence with American families who'd hosted them. These letters, carefully preserved in attics and archives, document a remarkable phenomenon: friendships emerging from enmity, sustained despite language barriers and geographic distance. A German farmer who'd worked in Nebraska wrote to the family whose farm he'd helped harvest, describing his rebuilding efforts and asking about their son who'd returned from France. An American farmer sent packages of food and clothing to his former prisoner worker, recognizing that Germany's need was desperate. Some relationships grew deeper. In the 1950s, as travel restrictions eased and economies recovered, a small but significant number of former prisoners returned to America. Some came as tourists, revisiting the places of their captivity with different eyes, meeting again the families who'd shown them kindness. Others came as immigrants, deciding that the country they'd been taught to hate offered better opportunities than devastated Germany. They settled in the same communities where they'd been prisoners, married American women, raised families, and became citizens. These return migrations, though small in absolute numbers, carried symbolic weight. Men who'd come in chains returned freely. Men who'd been enemies became neighbors. The transformation from Wehrmacht soldier to American citizen encapsulated a larger truth about human capacity for change and the power of decent treatment to transcend old hatred. The impact on German families extended generationally. Former prisoners raised their children with stories that complicated simple narratives about the war. They taught their sons and daughters that enemies could be humane, that national identity mattered less than individual character, that even in war's midst, decency was possible. These lessons, transmitted in countless private conversations, contributed to Germany's post-war evolution toward democracy and reconciliation. Historical documentation of these experiences accumulated slowly. In the 1960s and 1970s, historians began collecting oral histories from former POWs. The testimonies revealed consistent themes: surprise at American abundance, gratitude for fair treatment, cognitive dissonance between propaganda and reality, and enduring respect for American values even when critical of American politics. Academic studies analyzed these accounts, recognizing their importance for understanding post-war German-American relations. Museums and memorials eventually acknowledged this history. In Kansas, a small museum at the site of former Camp Concordia preserves artifacts and stories from the POW era. In Germany, exhibits at war museums include sections on prisoner experiences in different nations, showing the stark contrasts in treatment. These public acknowledgments validate the experiences of former prisoners and educate new generations about this unusual chapter of World War II history. The psychological impact on individuals varied. Some former prisoners integrated their captivity seamlessly into their life stories, viewing it as a fortunate accident of war. Others struggled with survivor's guilt, aware that comrades captured by Soviets had suffered and died while they'd been safe and well-fed. Still others experienced their American captivity as a turning point, a moment when their worldview shifted fundamentally and permanently. One particular poignant legacy appears in the teaching of history. German educators, many descended from former POWs, teach their students about American prisoner treatment as a counterpoint to German atrocities. The contrast between how Germany treated prisoners and how America treated German prisoners becomes a moral lesson about the importance of international law and human rights even in war. The story of well-fed German prisoners in American camps stands as evidence that civilization can persist even in civilization's collapse. Political implications extended into Cold War dynamics. West Germany's alignment with the United States owed something to these positive prisoner experiences. When Germans chose between East and West, between Soviet and American influence, former POWs carried knowledge that shaped those choices. They'd seen both systems, or at least heard reliable accounts from comrades. The choice, for many, was obvious. The weight gain of German prisoners in American camps was never just about food. It was about strategy, values, and a profound understanding of how wars end and what comes after. American military and political leaders understood something in 1943 that would prove crucial in 1945 and beyond. The treatment of prisoners would matter long after the last shot was fired. They recognized that every prisoner would eventually return home, carrying stories that would shape German perceptions of America for generations. This wasn't sentiment. It was cold calculation wrapped in humanitarian principles. The Geneva Convention provided the legal framework, but American compliance went beyond mere obligation. The United States could afford generosity. American agricultural surplus meant feeding prisoners well cost little. American industrial capacity meant building and maintaining camps was manageable. American geography meant prisoners posed minimal security risk. Escape was pointless when you were thousands of miles from home. These practical advantages created space for strategic humanitarianism. The cost-benefit analysis was remarkably favorable. Feeding a German prisoner well cost approximately $2 per day, in 1944 dollars. In exchange, America got productive labor during critical agricultural seasons, prevented prison unrest that would have required expensive security measures, complied with international law that protected American prisoners abroad, and created goodwill that would pay dividends in occupation and reconstruction. The investment was modest. The return was substantial. Psychological warfare played a significant role. American authorities wanted prisoners to see American abundance, to experience American fairness, to understand that democracy and prosperity were connected. They wanted prisoners to return to Germany as witnesses to American power and values. Every well-fed prisoner was a walking advertisement for the American system, a living refutation of Nazi propaganda about American weakness and degeneracy. The contrast with Soviet treatment wasn't accidental. American officials ensured that prisoners understood the difference between American and Soviet approaches. This wasn't subtle. The message was clear. The system that fed you well and treated you fairly is superior to the system that starved and brutalized your comrades. Choose accordingly when the war ends. The long-term strategic thinking proved remarkably prescient. The Marshall Plan succeeded, partly because Germans trusted American intentions. The NATO alliance included West Germany partly because Germans viewed America as a reliable partner. The economic miracle of West German reconstruction happened partly because American-German cooperation had foundations built during the war, including positive prisoner experiences that created baseline trust. The numbers ultimately told the story of success. Of 400,000 German prisoners held in America, 99.5% survived to return home. They returned healthier than when captured, carrying skills learned in captivity and holding generally positive views of American fairness and abundance. They became ambassadors for democracy in a nation that desperately needed to hear that message. The cost was modest, the benefit was incalculable. But beyond strategy and statistics, something more fundamental was at work. American treatment of German prisoners reflected core values about human dignity and the rule of law. The decision to feed enemies well while American citizens faced rationing, to provide medical care to men who'd fought against American soldiers, to allow recreation and education and even hospitality toward prisoners, represented a choice about what kind of nation America would be. This choice wasn't unanimous or uncontroversial. Some Americans bitterly opposed generous treatment of enemy prisoners. Letters to newspapers protested that Germans should suffer as Allied prisoners in German camps had suffered. Families who lost sons in combat questioned why enemies ate well while American boys died. The criticism was understandable and came from genuine pain. But American leadership held firm to Geneva Convention principles, not from weakness but from strength. The decision to maintain standards even when it was unpopular, even when reciprocity wasn't guaranteed, even when the enemy had committed atrocities, says something important about American identity and values. It said that American behavior wasn't contingent on enemy behavior, that American principles operated even under the stress of total war, that civilization could be maintained even in civilization's collapse. The legacy extends beyond World War II. American prisoner treatment policies in subsequent conflicts, from Korea to the present, have referenced World War II German POW experiences as a model. The success of that program, measured in survival rates, rehabilitation effectiveness, and post-war relations, became a template. When questions arise about prisoner treatment, advocates for humane policies point to German POW camps in America as proof that fair treatment works, that it serves strategic interests while honoring values. Friedrich Weber, the corporal who stepped on that scale in November 1944 and discovered he'd gained 23 pounds, returned to Germany in March 1946. He found his hometown of Karlsruhe in ruins, his family living in the cellar, his mother 20 pounds lighter than when he'd left. The contrast haunted him. But he brought something home besides his healthy weight. He brought stories. He told his family about meals in Kansas that included meat every day. He described the American farmer who'd invited him to Sunday dinner. He explained how American camp guards had treated him firmly but fairly. He admitted that everything he'd been taught about America had been wrong. His children, born in the late 1940s, grew up hearing these stories. They learned that former enemies had shown their father kindness when he was powerless. They absorbed lessons about grace and dignity that transcended politics. When those children grew into adults, they became part of Germany's post-war generation that embraced democracy and Atlantic partnership. Weber's story multiplied 400,000 times across Germany. Not every prisoner had his exact experience. Not every story was positive. But the aggregate effect was undeniable. German soldiers gained weight in American captivity, while the world starved. They received better treatment as prisoners than they'd had as soldiers. They encountered an enemy that fed them, healed them, and sometimes even welcomed them into homes. The paradox was profound. America, fighting for its survival and the survival of civilization, chose to treat enemy prisoners with a generosity that seemed almost incomprehensible to a world brutalized by total war. It fed men who'd fought to destroy it. It showed mercy to those who showed none. It maintained standards when standards seemed like a luxury the world couldn't afford. Why? Because American leaders understood that how you treat the defeated matters as much as whether you defeat them. Because the investment in prisoner welfare was an investment in future peace. Because civilization persists only when even enemies are treated as human beings with rights that transcend political circumstances. German soldiers gained weight in American captivity because America chose a different path. Not from weakness, but from strength. Not from naivete, but from strategic wisdom. Not despite the war, but because of what would come after the war. The weight gain was never just about food. It was about values in action. It was about the power of decent treatment to transform enemies into partners. It was about planting seeds of reconciliation even while the war still raged. Those pounds of flesh gained in Kansas and Nebraska and Texas represented something larger than nutrition. They represented a choice about what kind of victor America would be. 70 years later, the alliance between America and Germany stands as one of the strongest partnerships in the world. The foundation was built, in part, on Sunday dinners shared between former enemies, on meals that left German soldiers healthier as prisoners than they'd been as soldiers, on a choice to feed rather than punish. Friedrich Weber lived to see his grandchildren grow up in a peaceful, democratic Germany, allied with the United States. When they asked him about the war, he told them about many things, but he always came back to the same image. Standing on a scale in a Kansas prison camp, discovering he'd gained 23 pounds, and realizing in that moment that everything he thought he knew about America had been propaganda, and the truth was far more complicated and far more hopeful. The weight gain mattered because it was evidence. Evidence that even in humanity's darkest moment, dignity survived. Evidence that enemies could become friends. Evidence that the rules of civilization, maintained even under terrible pressure, could build a peace that endured long after the guns fell silent.